In the quiet reaches of the far north, where the land breaks into 1,000 fragments, and the sea threads between them like silver veins through stone, there existed a world that few beyond its shores understood. This was Scandinavia, in the centuries before its people became known to history as Vikings, a word that would come to mean raider, warrior, seafarer, and explorer all at once. But before the longships cut their paths across distant waters, before the monasteries of England and Francia learned to fear the dragon-proud vessels that appeared without warning from the mist, there was simply life in the north. Hard life, to be certain, carved from landscapes that offered little mercy and demanded constant vigilance against the turning of seasons. The geography itself shaped everything that would follow. Norway stretched along the western edge of the Scandinavian peninsula, its coastline fractured into countless fjords, where the sea reached deep into mountain valleys, like the fingers of some primordial hand. These waterways, carved by glaciers over millennia, created natural harbors and highways that made the ocean not a barrier but a road. To the east lay Sweden, its interior dominated by vast forests and chains of lakes that connected like stepping stones across the land. Denmark occupied the southern reaches, a peninsula and archipelago of islands, where the Baltic Sea met the North Sea, a crossroads of northern waters. Together, these lands held perhaps 1 million souls in the 8th century, scattered in settlements that followed the coasts and navigable rivers, clustered around the arable land that could be wrested from forest and stone. The climate was unforgiving, but not impossible. Summers were brief and precious, the growing season measured in weeks rather than months, making every harvest a gamble against early frost. Winters stretched long and dark, the sun barely clearing the horizon in the far north, and survival depended on careful preparation: salted fish, dried meat, stores of grain gathered during the light months. The people who lived here learned patience and planning, learned to read the sky and sea, learned that prosperity came not from abundance, but from cleverness in the face of scarcity. They built their lives around the longhouse, rectangular structures of timber and turf that served as home, workshop, stable, and gathering hall all at once. These buildings stretched sometimes 30 meters or more, their interiors dim and smoky from the central hearth that burned day and night against the cold. Inside these halls, life organized itself around kinship and hierarchy. Families extended to include distant cousins, fosterings, servants and slaves, captured in raids or born into bondage. The household head, usually a man but occasionally a woman of sufficient wealth and authority, managed not just people but also reputation, the intricate web of obligation and honor that bound communities together. In a world without strong centralized authority, without written law codes or standing armies, reputation was currency. A person's word, their record of keeping oaths and repaying debts, their willingness to support kin in times of conflict. These things determined status more than any title. Chieftains rose and fell based on their ability to attract followers, to redistribute wealth gained through trade or raid, to host feasts where warriors and retainers gathered to drink and pledge loyalty. Society was stratified, but not rigid. At the top stood the jarls, wealthy landowners, who controlled territories and commanded ships and fighting men. Below them came the karls, free farmers and craftsmen, who owned land and bore arms, who had voice in local assemblies, but owed service to their jarl. At the bottom were the thralls, slaves without rights or property, whose labor supported the households of their masters. Yet mobility was possible. A clever farmer might prosper and rise in status. A slave might earn or buy freedom. A young man of no particular birth might distinguish himself in battle or trade, and attract the notice of a chieftain, willing to grant him land and opportunity. The system rewarded boldness and capability, and in the centuries before the Viking Age properly began, Scandinavian society was gradually becoming more complex, more stratified, more capable of organizing large-scale enterprises. The religion of these northern people centered on gods who reflected their own values and struggles. Odin, the All-Father, one-eyed wanderer and seeker of wisdom, patron of warriors and poets alike. Thor, wielder of the hammer Mjolnir, protector against giants and chaos, god of thunder and strength. Freyja, goddess of fertility and battle, magic and desire. These deities were not distant or abstract, but present in the world, active in human affairs, demanding worship and sacrifice. Religious practice focused on the blot, ritual sacrifices of animals, and occasionally humans, at sacred sites marked by groves of trees or standing stones. There were no grand temples in most places, no professional priest class. Religion was woven into daily life, into the naming of children and the blessing of ships, into the runes carved on wood and stone, to invoke protection or curse enemies. Yet perhaps nothing defined pre-Viking Scandinavia more than its relationship with the sea. For people living on fractured coastlines and island chains, maritime technology was not luxury, but necessity. By the 7th century, Scandinavian boatwrights had already developed sophisticated vessels, clinker-built craft with overlapping planks that created hulls both strong and flexible, able to withstand the tremendous forces of ocean waves. These early ships were primarily rowing vessels, propelled by crews of oarsmen, though they also carried simple square sails. They were used for fishing, for coastal trade, for moving between settlements separated by water. But they were limited in range and capability, suitable for Baltic crossings or journeys along the coast, but not for the open Atlantic or extended expeditions far from home. The transformation came gradually, the result of incremental improvements in design, materials, and technique. Shipwrights learned to select oak with just the right grain, trees that had grown slowly in particular conditions to produce timber, both strong and workable. They developed iron tools capable of shaping massive planks with precision. They experimented with hull shapes, with the placement of masts, with sail configurations that could harness the wind more efficiently. They created keels that ran the length of the ship, providing structural integrity and allowing the vessel to sail closer to the wind. Each innovation was small, but together they produced something revolutionary, the true Viking longship, a vessel that could cross oceans, navigate rivers, land on beaches without need of harbors, and outrun or outmaneuver any contemporary ship. When that technology matured in the late 8th century, it gave Scandinavian sailors an advantage so overwhelming that the entire dynamic of Northern Europe would be transformed. Trade networks already stretched far beyond Scandinavia's shores before the Viking Age began. Amber from Baltic beaches was prized throughout Europe and even reached the Mediterranean. Furs from the northern forests, bear, wolf, marten, otter, found eager markets in Frankish and Byzantine lands. Iron, produced in bog or furnaces scattered across the region, was worked into tools and weapons of increasingly high quality. In return came silver, glass beads, fine textiles, wine, and luxury goods that marked status among northern elites. Trade routes followed rivers and coasts, passing through emerging market towns, where merchants gathered seasonally to exchange goods. These interactions exposed Scandinavians to the wealth of southern kingdoms, to the existence of monasteries and towns filled with valuable items and protected only by prayer, to the possibilities that lay beyond their traditional horizons. By the late 8th century, all the elements were in place. A society organized around warrior values and maritime capability, a religion that celebrated boldness and promised glory to those who died in battle, a population growing beyond what marginal farmland could easily support, creating pressure to seek wealth and land elsewhere, and most critically, ships capable of reaching anywhere in the known world and beyond. What was needed was only the spark, the moment when opportunity and capability aligned, when some group of raiders decided to venture beyond mere coastal trading and test whether distant shores could be taken by force. That moment came on a summer day in the year 793, on a small island off the coast of Northumbria, at a monastery dedicated to a saint named Aidan. The raid on Lindisfarne would announce to the world that the Viking Age had begun. The island rises from the North Sea, like a prayer-made stone, connected to the mainland by a causeway that appears and disappears with the tides. Lindisfarne, holy island to those who dwelt there, had been sacred ground for nearly a century and a half by the time the dragon ships appeared on the horizon. It was founded in 635 by the Irish monk Aidan at the invitation of King Oswald of Northumbria, established as a monastery at a time when Christianity was still finding its footing in Anglo-Saxon England. The monks who lived there had chosen isolation as a path to devotion, removing themselves from the complications and temptations of worldly life, to focus on prayer, study, and the copying of sacred texts. The island provided that separation while remaining accessible enough to serve as a base for missionary work among the Northumbrian people. By 793, Lindisfarne had become one of the jewels of Northumbrian Christianity. Its scriptorium produced illuminated manuscripts that were marvels of medieval art. Its church held relics of St. Cuthbert, whose cult drew pilgrims from across northern England. The monastery had accumulated wealth in the form of precious metalwork, decorated gospel books, altar furnishings crafted from gold and silver, bejeweled reliquaries that held the bones of saints. This was not wealth in the sense that a king or great landowner would understand it. The monks lived simply, their riches dedicated to the glory of God, rather than personal comfort. But to raiders arriving from across the sea, such distinctions meant nothing. They saw gold, silver, fine craftsmanship, and most importantly, a target that was both rich and defenseless. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that year-by-year record of events in early medieval England, records the raid with a sense of shock that still resonates across the centuries. In this year, fierce, foreboding omens came over the land of Northumbria. There were excessive whirlwinds, lightning storms, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky. These signs were followed by great famine, and shortly after in the same year, on the 8th of June, the ravaging of heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne through brutal robbery and slaughter. The chronicler's horror is palpable, the cosmic disturbances recorded as if nature itself recoiled at what was about to occur. Whether the monks actually did witness strange atmospheric phenomena, or whether the chronicler retroactively assigned portents to explain the catastrophe, we cannot know. What is certain is that nothing in their experience had prepared them for what arrived on that June morning. The Vikings, perhaps Norwegian, though we cannot be certain, would have timed their approach carefully. The tides around Lindisfarne are dramatic, the causeway passable only at low water, the island effectively isolated when the sea rises. Ships approaching from the east would have been visible from the island for some time, but monastic communities did not maintain lookouts or defences. The monks likely watched the vessels approach with curiosity rather than alarm. Trade ships occasionally called at coastal settlements. Perhaps these were merchants from distant lands. By the time the true nature of the visitors became clear, it was too late to flee. The causeway was impassable, the boats had landed, and men in mail and leather were pouring onto the island with weapons drawn. What followed was systematic and brutal. The raiders were not interested in conversion or negotiation. They came for portable wealth, and they took it with ruthless efficiency. The altar was stripped of its gold and silver furnishings. Reliquaries were pried open, and their contents scattered. Bones of saints meant nothing to pagans who worshipped different gods. Illuminated manuscripts, hundreds of hours of painstaking work by monks who had dedicated their lives to creating beauty in service of faith, were torn apart, the jeweled covers removed, and the parchment pages left to scatter in the wind. Some monks were killed outright, cut down as they fled, or stood frozen in shock. Others were taken captive, bound and herded toward the ships, to be sold as slaves in markets across the North Sea. The buildings themselves were put to the torch, though the stone church would survive in damaged form. When the raiders departed, rowing back out to sea with their loot, they left behind a scene of devastation that would reverberate across Christian Europe. The shock was not merely about the material loss, though that was significant. It was about violation of the sacred, about the apparent impunity with which heathens had descended on one of Christianity's holy places and subjected it to violence that seemed to mock the very idea of divine protection. Alcuin of York, the greatest scholar of his age and an advisor to Charlemagne, wrote a series of anguished letters in the raid's aftermath. To the monks who survived, he wrote, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God like dung in the streets." To the king of Northumbria, he wrote, seeking explanations in divine displeasure, "Consider carefully, brothers, and examine diligently, lest perchance this unaccustomed and unheard of evil was merited by some unheard of evil practice." The theological explanations that God had allowed this calamity as punishment for sin were in their way as telling as the material facts. Christian Europe had no framework for understanding seaborne raiders who appeared without warning and disappeared just as quickly, who showed no interest in territorial conquest or negotiation, who simply took what they wanted and vanished beyond the horizon. The monastic network that spread across Britain and Ireland, with its wealthy but undefended religious houses scattered along coasts and rivers, had developed in a context where power struggles were between Christian kingdoms, where even in conflict there was a shared understanding that churches were sanctuaries. The Vikings recognized no such constraints. To them, a monastery was simply a storehouse of valuables guarded by unarmed men, an obvious target. Lindisfarne was not quite the first raid, but it was the most famous, the one that entered the historical record, with such force that it came to mark the beginning of a new era. There had been earlier attacks, a raid on Portland in Wessex in 787, other incidents that left fewer traces in the sources. But Lindisfarne crystallized the pattern and announced that something fundamental had changed in the political and military geography of Northern Europe. The North Sea, which had seemed a barrier protecting Britain from continental conflicts, had become a highway for warriors whose ships could cross open water with ease, and whose motivations were unlike anything Christian kingdoms had previously encountered. In the years immediately following, the raids intensified. In 794, monasteries at Jarrow and Monkwearmouth in Northumbria were attacked. In 795, Vikings struck Iona in the Hebrides, the great monastery founded by Saint Columba, one of the most important religious centres in the Celtic Christian world. They would return to Iona again in 802 and 806, the latter raid resulting in the deaths of 68 monks. Ireland's coast was ravaged repeatedly, its monasteries plundered, its people taken as slaves. The pattern was consistent: fast approach by sea, overwhelming force applied to defenseless targets, rapid withdrawal with portable wealth. It was warfare as piracy, and the defending kingdoms had no effective response. By the time warning could be carried inland, and forces mobilized, the raiders were long gone, back to ships that could outpace any pursuit. The longship made it all possible. Without that technological advantage, the Vikings would have been simply another group of barbarians on Europe's periphery, capable perhaps of raiding neighbors, but unable to project power across vast distances. But the ships they sailed were unlike anything else on the water, representing hundreds of years of accumulated knowledge about how to build vessels that could survive and thrive in the world's most challenging maritime environments. The great ship burials discovered by archaeologists, the Oseberg ship in Norway, the Gokstad ship, the vessels excavated at Skuldulv in Denmark, give us extraordinary insight into these craft, preserving in waterlogged conditions the timber and construction techniques that would otherwise have rotted away centuries ago. The Gokstad ship, discovered in a burial mound in 1880, is perhaps the finest example of Viking Age shipbuilding that survives. Built around 890 AD, near the end of the period we are considering, it represents the mature form of the ocean-going longship. The vessel is just over 23 meters long and 5 meters wide at its broadest point. Clinker built from 16 strakes of oak planks overlapping and riveted together with iron nails. The planks vary in thickness, thicker near the waterline, where forces are greatest, thinner higher up to save weight. The keel is a single piece of oak, carefully selected from a tree, with the right natural curve, running the entire length of the ship, and providing both structural integrity and the ability to sail closer to the wind than a vessel with a flat bottom could manage. What strikes anyone who studies these ships is how thin the planking is, how flexible the hull, how everything seems designed to give and bend rather than resist rigidly. A longship in rough seas would twist and flex with the waves. The clinker construction, allowing the strakes to move slightly relative to each other while maintaining overall integrity. This flexibility made the ships incredibly resilient, able to survive conditions that would have broken more rigidly constructed vessels. The ships were also remarkably light relative to their size. The Gokstad ship displaced about 20 tons when fully loaded, but could be portaged or dragged across land when necessary, carried over narrow isthmuses, or pulled up rivers that became too shallow for sailing. The mast, when raised, stood in a massive block of oak called a keelson, which distributed the forces across multiple ribs and prevented the mast from punching through the hull. The single square sail, woven from wool and often reinforced with leather, could be reefed or furled depending on wind conditions. In favorable winds, a longship could maintain speeds of 15 knots or more, fast enough to outrun any contemporary vessel. When wind failed or direction was wrong, the crew could take to the oars. The Gokstad ship had 16 pairs of oar holes, suggesting a crew of at least 32 rowers, though the ship could carry more men when configured for raiding rather than trading. The shallow draft was perhaps the most strategically important feature. A fully loaded longship drew less than a meter of water, allowing it to navigate rivers far inland, to be run up onto beaches without need of harbours or docks, to operate in coastal waters too shallow for deeper keeled vessels. This meant that Vikings could strike almost anywhere along a coastline or river system, appearing suddenly and withdrawing before defences could be organised. They could sail up the Thames to raid settlements deep in the English interior, penetrate up the Seine to threaten Paris, navigate Russian river systems to reach the Black Sea. The ships gave them strategic mobility that contemporary powers simply could not match. But ships were not merely tools. They were also symbols, objects of profound cultural significance. The vessel was a man's greatest possession, the means by which he provided for his household through trade or war, the vehicle that would carry him on his final journey if he were wealthy enough to be buried with his ship. The great ship burials, Oseberg, Gokstad, Sutton Hoo in England, speak to this symbolic importance. These were not simply graves but statements, declarations that the deceased had been a person of consequence, wealthy enough to sacrifice a valuable ship, important enough that the community would devote enormous labor to creating a burial mound that would stand for centuries. The Oseberg ship burial, excavated in 1904, contained not just the ship but an entire household's worth of goods: a beautifully carved wagon, several sleds, beds, tapestries, agricultural tools, cooking equipment, and the remains of 2 women, one elderly and one younger, suggesting a chieftain or queen buried with a servant, or perhaps a sacrifice. Ship imagery permeated Viking Age art and consciousness. Runestones often depicted ships in stylized form, memorials to men who had sailed to distant lands and died far from home. Grave markers were sometimes arranged in the shape of ships, stones placed to outline a vessel's form on the ground. The metaphor of life as a voyage, of death as a final sailing, ran deep in Norse thought. The ships were also profoundly practical achievements, representing the accumulated knowledge of generations of boatwrights who understood their materials intimately, who knew which trees would yield the best timber, how to split oak planks along the grain so they would be strong yet flexible, how to achieve the curves and angles that would produce a fast, seaworthy hull. The construction process began in the forest, with the selection of trees. Oak was preferred for most of the hull, its strength and durability unmatched by other available timbers. But not just any oak would do. Shipwrights looked for slow-grown trees from particular locations, trees whose grain ran straight and true, whose wood would split cleanly into long planks. Pine was sometimes used for the upper strakes, where lightness mattered more than strength. The keel required a tree with a natural curve, perhaps grown on a slope where the trunk bent as it reached for light. Each tree was chosen for its particular qualities, and each part of the ship was crafted from the wood best suited to its function. Shaping the planks required both strength and precision. Using axes and adzes, shipwrights would split the oak along its grain, creating long planks perhaps 20 meters or more in length. These would be shaped by eye and experience, the craftsman understanding intuitively how much curve was needed, how the strakes would fit together when the ship took form. The clinker construction method, overlapping strakes fastened with iron rivets, created a hull that was both strong and flexible, each plank slightly overlapping the one below it. The seam caulked with rope made from wool or animal hair soaked in pitch or tar to make it watertight. Building a major longship was a community effort, requiring months of labor by skilled craftsmen. It was also expensive, requiring not just materials and labor, but also the iron for hundreds of rivets, the wool for the sail, the rope for rigging. Only wealthy individuals or communities could afford to build such vessels from scratch, though ships could be inherited, captured in raids, or purchased from successful traders. The investment was worth it because a good ship, well maintained, could last for generations, carrying its owners on voyages that would accumulate wealth far exceeding the vessel's original cost. A single successful raid on a monastery might yield silver and goods worth more than the ship itself. A trading voyage to Constantinople could return with silk and spices that would make a merchant wealthy. The longship was not just transportation, it was capital, the means of production in an economy increasingly oriented around maritime enterprise. By the early 9th century, the raids that had begun with opportunistic strikes on isolated monasteries were evolving into something more systematic. Individual ships gave way to small fleets. Summer raiding expeditions became annual events. Certain targets were hit repeatedly, their wealth replenished only to be plundered again years later. But Vikings were not merely raiders. The same ships that carried warriors to Lindisfarne also carried merchants to trade in legitimate markets, and often the same individuals engaged in both activities, raiding when opportunities presented themselves, and trading when that was more profitable. The line between Viking and merchant was fluid, situation-dependent, pragmatic rather than categorical. The trading network that Vikings built or expanded reached across the known world and beyond. In the east, Swedish Vikings known as Römises and Slavic lands followed river routes through what is now Russia, establishing trading posts at Staraja Ladoga, Novgorod, and eventually Kiev. They traded furs, amber, slaves, and honey, carrying these goods down the Danube River to the Black Sea, and then to Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, where they exchanged northern products for silk, spices, wine, and most importantly, silver. Arabian silver, mined in Central Asia and minted into dirhams, flowed north along these trade routes in enormous quantities. Thousands of these coins have been found in Scandinavian hoards, buried by individuals who either died before retrieving their wealth or hid it so well that it was never recovered. In the west, Vikings established or expanded trading towns that became the commercial hubs of northern Europe. Hedeby, located at the base of the Jutland Peninsula, sat at the crossroads of Baltic and North Sea trade routes. Ships could sail from the Baltic into the Schlei Inlet, offload cargo at Hedeby, portage it a short distance overland, and reload onto ships bound for the North Sea, avoiding the dangerous voyage around the northern tip of Denmark. The town grew wealthy on this transshipment trade, its merchants dealing in everything from wine and glassware from the Rhineland to furs and amber from the far north. Archaeological excavations at Hedeby have revealed a cosmopolitan settlement with streets and property boundaries, workshops producing goods for export, and imports from across Europe and beyond. Birka in Sweden, located on an island in Lake Mälaren, served a similar function for Baltic trade. Its position gave it access to both the rich agricultural lands around the lake and the sea routes that connected Scandinavia to the wider world. Merchants from Birka traded throughout the Baltic, bringing home silver, silk, and luxury goods that marked the status of Swedish elites. The graves at Birka tell stories of wealth and far-flung connections. Chamber tombs containing glass beakers from the Rhineland, silk from Byzantium, weapons of Frankish manufacture, and coins from as far away as the Islamic caliphates. These were not simple farmers or raiders, but sophisticated merchants operating in an international economy. Dublin, established by Norwegian Vikings around 841, became one of the most important towns in the Irish Sea region. Initially founded as a long fort, or fortified ship base, used for raiding inland Ireland, it evolved into a permanent settlement and major trading centre. Dublin's merchants dealt in slaves, captured in raids across Ireland and Britain, shipping them to markets in Iceland, Scandinavia, and sometimes as far as the Islamic world. They traded Irish metalwork, livestock, and agricultural products, bringing in return wine, salt, pottery, and manufactured goods from Francia and England. The town grew wealthy and powerful, its Norse rulers eventually intermarrying with Irish dynasties and becoming players in the complex politics of Irish kingdoms. The dual nature of Viking expansion, raiding and trading as complementary rather than contradictory activities, reflected a fundamental pragmatism in Norse culture. Warriors and merchants were often the same people, and the decision whether to fight or trade depended on circumstances, the strength of local defenses, the likelihood of profit through commerce versus theft, the political relationships between Vikings and the people they encountered. A Viking fleet might raid monasteries along the English coast in spring, trade peacefully at a Frankish port in summer, and winter in Ireland before beginning the cycle again the following year. This flexibility made them unpredictable and difficult to counter, as no purely military or diplomatic strategy could address the full range of their activities. The wealth that flowed back to Scandinavia from these enterprises transformed northern society. All silver hoards accumulated in the halls of chieftains, displayed as both wealth and status markers. Luxury goods, wine, silk, fine weapons, jewelry, became markers of distinction, ways that successful raiders and traders could demonstrate their achievements. This wealth was not hoarded, but redistributed through feasting, gift-giving, and patronage, creating networks of obligation that bound warriors to leaders and cemented social hierarchies. A chieftain's power depended on his ability to attract and retain followers, and that required demonstrating generosity, providing opportunities for younger men to gain wealth and glory through raids or trading expeditions. Success bred success. A leader who could organize profitable ventures attracted more followers, could field larger crews and fleets, could undertake more ambitious expeditions. This dynamic created pressure for escalation. Small raids gave way to larger ones. Single ships became fleets. Summer expeditions extended into year-round campaigns, as Vikings established winter camps in target territories, rather than sailing home each autumn. The transformation from raider to conqueror began not as a grand strategy, but as a series of incremental decisions, each making practical sense in its context, collectively producing a fundamental shift in the nature of Viking activity in Western Europe. By the mid-9th century, it was no longer sufficient to describe Vikings as raiders. In many places, they had become invaders, settlers, and would-be rulers, seeking not just portable wealth, but land, power, and permanent establishments in territories far from their Scandinavian homelands. The arrival of the Great Heathen Army in England, in 865, marked the definitive transition from raiding to conquest. This was not a raiding party, but an army, perhaps numbering in the thousands, carried by hundreds of ships, and clearly intending to do more than strike and withdraw. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls it a Great Heathen Army, distinguishing it from the smaller raiding parties that had plagued English coasts for decades. Medieval chroniclers did not provide exact numbers, and modern estimates vary wildly, but this was clearly the largest Viking force yet assembled for operations in England, large enough to take on Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in open battle and sustain multi-year campaigns deep in enemy territory. The army was reportedly led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan and Ubba, though the historicity of Ragnar himself is questionable, and these leaders may have been aggregated from different sources by later saga writers. Whether the filial connection was real or legendary, the leadership was clearly capable, coordinating movements across different regions and maintaining cohesion for a campaign that would last more than a decade. The initial landing was in East Anglia, whose King Edmund initially provided horses and supplies, perhaps hoping to redirect the Vikings against his enemies, or simply to get them out of his kingdom as quickly as possible. This would prove a fatal miscalculation. The Vikings moved north into Northumbria, taking York in 866. The city, known to the English as Eoforwic and to the Vikings as Jorvik, was one of the great urban centres of Anglo-Saxon England, a former Roman legionary fortress that had evolved into an ecclesiastical centre and royal residence. Its capture was both strategically and symbolically significant. York sat at the confluence of trade routes and river systems, controlling access to northern England. It was also a centre of Northumbrian Christianity, its cathedral claiming precedence over much of northern Britain. The Vikings took the city in November, capturing it during a period of political chaos, when rival claimants to the Northumbrian throne were fighting each other. The two kings, Osberht and Orla, briefly reconciled and mounted a counterattack in March 867, but were both killed in the fighting. Northumbria, as an independent kingdom, effectively ceased to exist. From York, the great heathen army ranged across England, exploiting the divisions between Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of English politics. In 869, they returned to East Anglia and defeated King Edmund, who was killed in the battle or its aftermath. Later Christian tradition would transform him into a martyr saint, claiming he was killed for refusing to renounce his faith. With East Anglia subdued and Northumbria conquered, the Vikings turned to Mercia, the Midland kingdom that had been the dominant Anglo-Saxon power in the 8th century, but was now in decline. They took the royal centre at Nottingham, wintered at Torksey on the Trent, and gradually brought Mercia under their control, though they initially allowed a puppet king to rule rather than installing Viking leadership directly. By 870, only Wessex remained independent, and it was there that the Vikings faced their most determined resistance. Alfred, who would later be known as Alfred the Great, came to the throne of Wessex in 871 under dire circumstances. The kingdom was under sustained Viking attack, its forces stretched thin, its resources depleted by years of paying tribute and supporting military campaigns. In Alfred's first year as king, 9 major battles were fought against the Vikings, a grinding attritional struggle that left both sides exhausted. Neither could achieve decisive victory. The Vikings were too mobile and numerous to be pinned down and destroyed, while the West Saxons were too determined and well organized to be overrun quickly. The struggle continued for years, with the balance tipping now one way, now another. In 878, the Vikings, now led by a king named Guthrum, launched a surprise winter attack that nearly ended Wessex's independence. Alfred was forced to flee into the Somerset marshes, taking refuge at Athenry, a small fortified position in the wetlands where pursuers could not easily reach him. From this low point, Alfred slowly rebuilt his forces, using the marshes as a base from which to launch guerrilla attacks. In May 878, he emerged from hiding and gathered the levies of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. The two armies met at Eddington, in Wiltshire, where Alfred won a decisive victory, besieging the Vikings in their fortress at Chippenham until they agreed to terms. The Treaty of Wedmore that followed was not a simple peace agreement, but a watershed in English history. Guthrum agreed to accept Christian baptism, with Alfred standing as his godfather, symbolically accepting Alfred's lordship, while maintaining practical independence. More significantly, the treaty recognized Viking control over the eastern and northern portions of England, the region that would become known as the Danelaw. This was not temporary occupation, but permanent settlement. Vikings who had come as raiders and conquerors would now stay as landowners and farmers, establishing families and communities in territories they had taken by force. The Danelaw would eventually encompass roughly half of England, stretching from the Thames estuary in the south to Northumbria in the north, a zone where Scandinavian law and custom prevailed over Anglo-Saxon tradition. The archaeological evidence for this settlement is extensive and tells a more complex story than simple conquest and displacement. Place names are perhaps the clearest marker. Thousands of English villages bear names with Scandinavian elements. Thorps and bys marking Viking settlements. Names like Grimsby, Whitby, Scunthorpe, reflecting Norse personal names and suffixes. These are not just scattered examples, but dense concentrations in the Danelaw regions, suggesting substantial Norse presence. Linguistic evidence shows heavy Scandinavian influence on English, with hundreds of Norse words entering the language, including basic vocabulary for everyday items and actions: sky, egg, knife, take, give, and most tellingly, the pronouns they, them, and their. This degree of linguistic borrowing suggests not just Viking overlords ruling native populations, but substantial integration, intermarriage, and cultural blending. Material culture shows similar patterns of mixture. Viking-style oval brooches, worn by Scandinavian women, appear in Anglo-Saxon contexts. English brooches show up in Viking graves. Pottery styles merge, combining elements from both traditions. Hoards of silver coins, both Anglo-Saxon and Viking issues, contain coins cut into pieces, reflecting the Viking practice of weighing silver by weight, rather than counting coins, a practice called hack silver, that gradually influenced Anglo-Saxon monetary practice. The burials themselves, where we can identify them confidently as Viking, show adaptation to local customs, with Christian burial practices increasingly replacing pagan ship burials and cremations as the generations passed. The political organization of the Danelaw is harder to reconstruct because it left fewer written records than the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to the south and west. The Vikings do not seem to have created a single unified Danelaw kingdom, but rather a patchwork of smaller territories ruled by jarls and kings who acknowledged no higher authority. The 5 boroughs, Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, and Stamford, became major centres, fortified towns that served as regional capitals and trading hubs. York remained the preeminent city, the seat of Viking kings of Northumbria, who would rule with varying degrees of success until the last of them, Eric Bloodaxe, was expelled and killed in 954. These Viking rulers adopted some elements of Anglo-Saxon kingship, minting coins, issuing laws, claiming Christian identity, while maintaining Scandinavian cultural practices and legal traditions. For the common farmer in the Danelaw, life probably changed less than we might imagine. Most people lived in the same villages, worked the same fields, and followed the same agricultural cycles regardless of who ruled. What changed was the local hierarchy, Viking landowners replacing Anglo-Saxon ones in some places, intermarriage creating hybrid Anglo-Danish aristocracy in others. The legal system incorporated Scandinavian practices, with things local assemblies where free men gathered to judge disputes, replacing or supplementing Anglo-Saxon hundred courts. Over time, these systems would blend, creating legal and social structures that were neither fully English nor fully Scandinavian, but something new, a fusion culture that would eventually be reintegrated into a unified English kingdom, but would never entirely lose its distinct character. Alfred's achievement was not defeating the Vikings. He did not, and could not, but rather limiting their expansion, preserving Wessex as an independent kingdom, and laying the foundations for eventual reconquest. His successors, his son Edward the Elder and grandson Athelstan, would spend decades gradually pushing back Viking control, fortifying towns, building a network of burhs, fortified settlements that could serve as refuges and military bases, and slowly absorbing the Danelaw back into English royal control. But that reconquest would take most of the 10th century, and even then, Viking cultural influence would remain embedded in northern and eastern England. The Great Heathen Army had not just raided England, it had permanently altered the island's demographic, linguistic, and cultural landscape. While the Great Heathen Army was conquering eastern England, other Vikings were looking beyond even Britain's shores, westward into the vast Atlantic, where only legends suggested land might exist. The settlement of Iceland beginning around 870 represents one of the most remarkable achievements of the Viking Age. The colonization of a large uninhabited island, nearly 1,000 kilometers from the nearest established Scandinavian settlement in the Faroe Islands. This was not raiding or conquest, but pioneering settlement in a landscape unlike anything in Scandinavia, a volcanic island of glaciers and lava fields where survival would require adaptation and determination. The initial discovery of Iceland is attributed to Norwegian sailors blown off course, but intentional settlement began with men like Ingolfur Einarsson, who is traditionally credited as Iceland's first permanent settler. He arrived around 874, with his family, servants, and livestock, landing on the southwest coast and eventually establishing a farm at the site that would become Reykjavik. Others followed quickly, drawn by reports of fertile land and grazing available for settlement, and within a few decades, Iceland's habitable coastal regions and valleys were claimed and farmed. The Book of Settlements, compiled in the 13th century but preserving earlier traditions, names some 400 settlers and describes the landtaking that transformed Iceland from empty wilderness to a Norse society. The settlers came primarily from western Norway, though many stopped in the Norse colonies in the British Isles before continuing to Iceland, bringing with them Celtic slaves and wives, adding a genetic and cultural component from Ireland and Scotland that would make Iceland's population distinct from mainland Scandinavia. They brought with them Norse social organization, religion, legal traditions, and most importantly, livestock, cattle, sheep, horses, goats, that would become the foundation of Icelandic economy. The island had no native mammals except Arctic foxes, no trees of significant size, no grain agriculture above the most marginal level. Survival depended on livestock grazing, fishing, and hunting seabirds and their eggs from cliff colonies. It was a difficult existence, but it was also freedom. Iceland had no kings, no established aristocracy with ancient land claims, no hierarchy except what settlers created themselves through achievement and negotiation. The landscape they settled was both beautiful and brutal. Active volcanoes punctuated the interior, occasionally erupting with devastating effect. Glaciers covered large portions of the island, their meltwaters creating braided rivers that could change course without warning, destroying farmland and making travel hazardous. Winters were dark and cold, though moderated somewhat by the Gulf Stream compared to comparable latitudes in mainland Scandinavia. Summer brought nearly endless daylight, a brief window for cutting hay and preparing for the long winter ahead. The coast was rugged, cut by numerous fjords that provided sheltered anchorages but made overland travel difficult. Most communication between settlements occurred by sea, with Icelanders maintaining the seafaring traditions of their Norwegian ancestors. Without a king or central authority, Iceland developed a unique form of governance based on local assemblies and a national parliament called the Althing, established around 930 at Thingvellir. This was not democracy, as we understand it. Power still rested with wealthy chieftains, called Gotha, and most people had no direct voice in decision-making. But it was a system based on law rather than royal decree, with disputes settled through negotiation and legal proceedings, rather than simply by force. The Althing met annually for 2 weeks in summer, bringing together chieftains and their followers from across Iceland for legal proceedings, arbitration of disputes, and social gathering. The site at Thingvellir, situated in a dramatic rift valley where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates are visibly separating, became the symbolic center of Icelandic identity, the place where the nation gathered and laws were proclaimed. Iceland remained pagan longer than most of Scandinavia, but Christianity eventually arrived through both missionary work and political pressure from Norwegian kings, who were themselves newly converted. In the year 1000, after intense debate at the Althing, Iceland officially adopted Christianity as its religion, though private pagan practices were tolerated for a time. The decision was pragmatic rather than purely spiritual. Iceland depended on trade with Christian Europe, and remaining pagan increasingly isolated the island economically and politically. The conversion was accomplished without the violence that accompanied Christianization in some other Norse lands, reflecting Iceland's tradition of settling disputes through law and negotiation. But some Icelanders, unhappy with growing Christian influence, and perhaps seeking new opportunities, looked further west. Legends spoke of land beyond Iceland, glimpsed by sailors blown off course, or visible from Iceland's westernmost points on clear days. Around 985, Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, organized an expedition to explore and settle this distant shore. He called it Greenland, a name deliberately chosen to make the place sound appealing to potential settlers, and established farms along the southwestern coast, in regions that offered limited but real possibilities for livestock grazing. The settlement was marginal, always vulnerable to climate fluctuations and isolation, but it survived for nearly 500 years, maintaining contact with Iceland and eventually converting to Christianity, building churches, and even a cathedral, before mysteriously vanishing in the 15th century. From Greenland, Norse exploration reached its furthest extent. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed west from Greenland and made landfall on the North American coast, probably in Newfoundland, but possibly farther south. The sagas that record these voyages describe 3 regions: Helluland, Stone Slabland, probably Baffin Island; Markland, Forestland, likely Labrador; and Vinland, Wineland, or possibly Meadowland, where grapes or berries grew, and where Norse explorers attempted to establish a settlement. They built houses, explored the coastline, cut timber to bring back to treeless Greenland. They encountered indigenous peoples, whom they called Skrallings, and attempted trade, but relations deteriorated into violence. The Norse settlement in North America was brief, probably only a few years. Archaeological excavations at lands or meadows in Newfoundland have confirmed the saga accounts, revealing the remains of Norse buildings identical in construction to those in Iceland and Greenland. Iron nails and worked wood, showing typical Viking Age construction techniques, a bronze cloak pin of Norse manufacture. The site is small, probably housing no more than 100 people, and it was abandoned after a short occupation. The reasons are not entirely clear from archaeology, though the sagas suggest escalating conflicts with indigenous peoples and difficulty establishing sustainable trade relationships. The settlement was too far from Greenland for easy reinforcement, too isolated to survive without friendly relations with local populations who vastly outnumbered the Norse newcomers. The failure to establish a permanent European presence in North America meant that Leif Erikson's voyage became a historical footnote rather than a world-changing event. The Norse who reached Vinland simply sailed back to Greenland and eventually Iceland, carrying stories of lands to the west, but making no lasting impact on the continent they briefly touched. 500 years would pass before Columbus crossed the Atlantic, and by then the Norse voyages were forgotten or reduced to vague legends. Only in the modern era, with archaeological confirmation at Landsoll Meadows, has the full significance of Norse exploration been recognized, that Vikings reached America, that they explored its coasts, that they built settlements, and that they withdrew, leaving behind only whispers in saga and a handful of artifacts buried under the turf of Newfoundland. The western voyages represent the furthest extent of Viking expansion, but equally significant was the eastern thrust, where Swedish Vikings penetrated deep into what are now Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, establishing the trade networks and political structures that would evolve into the medieval Rus state. The Volga and Dnieper rivers provided highways into the continental interior, routes along which furs, amber, honey, and slaves could be transported south to meet trade routes connecting to the Islamic world and Byzantium. This was a different kind of Viking expansion, less about raiding and more about establishing control over lucrative trade networks, though violence was certainly part of the process. The origins of the Russes are debated, but they almost certainly included substantial Scandinavian elements. The Primary Chronicle, a medieval Russes historical text, records a legend that the Slavic tribes of northern Russia invited a Varangian named Rurik to come and rule over them, bringing order to a region torn by internal conflicts. Whether this invitation story reflects genuine history or later myth-making is uncertain, but archaeological and linguistic evidence confirms significant Scandinavian presence in northern Russia by the 9th century. At Staraja Ladoga on Lake Ladoga, excavations have revealed substantial Viking Age occupation, with finds including Scandinavian-style weapons, jewelry, and ship rivets. Novgorod, which would become one of the great cities of medieval Russia, shows similar evidence of early Scandinavian involvement in its founding and development. From these northern bases, Rus traders and warriors penetrated south along river systems, portaging their boats between waterways to create continuous routes from the Baltic to the Black Sea and Caspian Sea. This required not just navigational skill, but also the ability to negotiate or fight past hostile populations, to establish and defend trading posts along the routes, to organize expeditions that might be away from home bases for months or years at a time. The rewards justified the risks. Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, was the wealthiest city in Europe, a market where northern goods commanded premium prices. The Islamic caliphates controlled another vast market, hungry for furs and slaves that Vikings could provide. The slave trade was particularly important and particularly brutal. Raids into Slavic territories provided captives who were marched or sailed south to distant markets. The very word slave derives from Slav, reflecting the scale of this commerce. Islamic sources describe the Ruses as fierce warriors and ruthless slavers, arriving at markets with human merchandise acquired through violence. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who encountered Ruses merchants on the Volga in 921, left one of the few detailed contemporary descriptions of Vikings. He described them as tall, ruddy, and heavily tattooed, maintaining their appearances and clothing, but also as brutally violent, engaging in casual sexual exploitation of slave women and conducting human sacrifices during funeral rites that he witnessed with horrified fascination. The Ruses gradually evolved from raiders and traders into a ruling class over Slavic populations. By the 10th century, Ruses princes ruled from Kiev, which had become a major political and commercial center. These rulers adopted Slavic language and many local customs, while maintaining connections to Scandinavia, creating a hybrid culture that was neither purely Norse nor purely Slavic. The most significant transformation came in 988, when Prince Vladimir I converted to Byzantine Christianity, bringing the Rus' state into the Orthodox Christian sphere and establishing religious and cultural ties with Byzantium that would profoundly shape Russian history for centuries to come. This conversion marked the end of the Rus' as Vikings in the traditional sense, though their Scandinavian origins would be remembered and commemorated in chronicles and legends. Some Rus' served in Byzantium itself, forming the elite Varangian Guard that protected Byzantine emperors. This military unit, composed initially of Scandinavian warriors, but later recruiting from other northern European peoples, became legendary for its loyalty and effectiveness. Service in the Guard was prestigious and lucrative, offering ambitious young men from Scandinavia a path to wealth and glory in the imperial city. The most famous Varangian Guard member was Harald Hardrada, who would later become King of Norway and die fighting at Stamford Bridge in England in 1066. His career traveling from Norway to Kiev to Constantinople, accumulating wealth and military experience before returning home to claim a throne, exemplifies the geographic scope and ambition of Viking Age Scandinavians. The eastern routes also brought Islamic silver, flowing into Scandinavia in vast quantities. Tens of thousands of Islamic dirhams have been found in Scandinavian hoards, minted in Central Asian cities, and carried north along the Volga trade route. This silver was the economic foundation of Viking Age prosperity, transformed into jewelry and display pieces that mark status, broken into hack silver for transactions, or simply hoarded as wealth. The flow of silver helps explain how Viking society could support the elaborate raiding and trading expeditions of the 9th and 10th centuries. There was genuine prosperity behind the expansion, drawn from trade networks that stretched from Iceland to Central Asia, from Ireland to Constantinople. The gods of the Vikings were not distant or abstract, but deeply woven into the fabric of daily life, understanding of the cosmos and the values that structured society. This was a religion without dogma or sacred texts, transmitted through oral tradition, poetry, and ritual practice. The gods were powerful but not omnipotent, subject to fate and ultimately doomed to fall at Ragnarok, the final battle when gods and giants would destroy each other and the world would be reborn. This eschatological vision of inevitable destruction followed by renewal reflected a worldview that accepted violence and change as fundamental to existence, that saw heroism not in victory, but in fighting bravely against insurmountable odds. Odin stood at the center of the pantheon, the All-Father, ruler of Asgard, god of wisdom, war, poetry, and death. He was a contradictory figure, noble yet treacherous, wise yet cruel, constantly seeking knowledge, even at terrible cost. Odin had sacrificed one eye to drink from Mimir's well of wisdom. He had hanged himself from Yggdrasil, the world tree, pierced by his own spear, suffering through 9 nights to gain knowledge of the runes. He gathered the souls of warriors who died in battle, bringing them to Valhalla where they feasted and fought until Ragnarok, when they would march out to fight beside the gods in the final battle. Odin was patron to kings and warriors, but also to poets and skalds, the god who could give victory in battle or inspire the composition of verse that would immortalize a hero's deeds. Thor, Odin's son, was perhaps more widely worshipped, a more straightforward and approachable deity. He was the protector of humanity, wielding his hammer Hrungnir against giants and other forces of chaos that threatened the ordered world. Thor was associated with thunder and strength, with the agricultural cycle and the protection of the common farmer. His hammer became one of the most common Viking Age symbols, worn as amulets and carved on memorial stones, a declaration of allegiance to the old gods, even as Christianity began spreading through Scandinavia. Thor's myths show him as direct and sometimes foolish, but ultimately reliable, the god who could be counted on to defend humanity against supernatural threats. Freyja, goddess of love and fertility, was also a warrior goddess, who claimed half of those who died in battle, sharing them with Odin. She practiced Sidra, a form of magic associated with prophecy and manipulation of fate, knowledge that Odin sought from her. Freyja's association with both sexuality and death, with magic and battle, reflects the complexity of Norse gender roles and the recognition that women held power in realms both domestic and supernatural. Other gods populated the pantheon: Freyja, god of prosperity and good weather; Tyr, god of law and justice; Heimdall, guardian of the rainbow bridge connecting the worlds; Loki, trickster and agent of chaos, who would ultimately betray the gods at Ragnarok. The Norse cosmos was structured as 9 worlds connected by Yggdrasil, the immense ash tree whose roots and branches linked all realms. Asgard was the home of the gods, connected to Midgard, the world of humans, by a rainbow bridge called Bifrost. Below lay Niflheim, realm of ice and mist, and Muspelheim, realm of fire. There was Jotunheim, land of giants, Vanaheim, home of the Vanir, an older family of gods, Alfheim for the light elves, Svartalfheim for dark elves or dwarves, and Helheim, the realm of the dead ruled by Hel, daughter of Loki. This complex cosmology reflected an understanding of the universe as multi-layered, with different realms existing simultaneously and intersecting in ways that could be accessed through magic, shamanic practice, or death. Fate, called word in Old English, and Urther in Old Norse, was a central concept in Viking worldview. The Norns, 3 female beings who dwelt at the base of Yggdrasil, wove the fates of gods and men, their decisions binding even Odin. This sense that fate was predetermined, yet must be met with courage, shaped Viking attitudes toward death and honor. A warrior knew that his death day was already decided. What mattered was how he faced it, whether he died bravely in battle or ignominiously in bed. The latter was called a straw death, dying without honor, destined for Hel's realm rather than the glory of Valhalla. This value system encouraged the risk-taking and martial aggression that characterized Viking Age warfare, while also providing meaning to the constant danger of life in that era. Religious practice centered on sacrifice, the blot, performed to gain favor from the gods or celebrate important occasions. Animals, often horses, but also cattle, pigs, or other livestock, would be ritually slaughtered, their blood sprinkled on altars and participants, their meat consumed in communal feasting. Human sacrifice occurred in certain contexts, particularly for major rituals or in times of crisis, though how common this was remains debated. Archaeological evidence includes bodies found in bogs, deliberately killed and deposited in ways that suggest ritual rather than simple murder or execution. Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, describes a great temple at Uppsala in Sweden where human and animal sacrifices hung from trees during festivals, though his account may be exaggerated or based on second-hand information. Sacred sites were often natural features, groves of trees, springs, unusual rock formations, places where the boundary between human world and divine realms seemed thin. Open-air sanctuaries have been identified archaeologically, recognizable by deposits of sacrifice and ritual items, even though the sites had no permanent structures. Later, as society became more complex, some communities built hofs, wooden temples, or hall-like structures dedicated to the gods, though these seem to have been relatively rare before the late Viking Age. Most worship occurred in less formal settings, with chieftains or heads of households leading rituals for their people. Magic and supernatural belief permeated Viking Age society. Runes, the angular letters of the Germanic alphabet, were understood to have inherent power, able to curse or protect, depending on how they were inscribed and activated. Seidr, a form of shamanic magic involving trance and prophecy, was practiced by specialists who could supposedly see the future, influence fate, or send their spirits traveling between worlds. Interestingly, Seidr was associated primarily with women and considered somewhat unmanly for men to practice, though even Odin engaged in it, according to myth. This suggests that Viking society, despite its warrior culture, recognized forms of power that transcended physical strength and male martial values. Christianity's arrival in Scandinavia was gradual and contested, extending over more than 2 centuries from the first missionary efforts in the early 9th century to the final conversion of Sweden in the 12th century. The process was driven by multiple factors: the political and economic advantages of aligning with Christian Europe, the influence of Christians encountered during raids and trade, missionary work by both foreign and Norse converts, and eventually royal imposition of the new faith. The conversion was rarely peaceful, often involving destruction of pagan sites, forced baptism, and violent suppression of resistance. Yet it also involved negotiation, syncretism, and the gradual transformation of religious practice, rather than sudden complete replacement. Denmark converted first, largely through royal initiative. Harald Bluetooth, king from around 958 to 987, famously proclaimed that he had made the Danes Christian on the great Jelling runestone he erected. The stone, one of the masterpieces of Viking Age art, shows Christ crucified, but also incorporates traditional Norse artistic styles, visual evidence of the cultural blending that accompanied conversion. Harald's motives were partly political. Christianity provided ideological justification for royal authority and facilitated diplomatic relations with the Christian Frankish kingdoms to the south. Whether ordinary Danes converted quickly or merely outwardly conformed, while maintaining pagan practices in private, is harder to determine. Archaeological evidence of burial practices shows gradual shift from pagan to Christian norms over several generations, suggesting the conversion was a process rather than a sudden event. Norway's conversion was more violent, driven by two kings in particular. Olaf Tryggvason, ruling from 995 to 1000, pursued aggressive Christianization, destroying pagan temples, forcing baptism on his subjects, and executing or torturing those who resisted. Olaf II Haraldsson, later canonized as Saint Olaf, continued this work after becoming king in 1015, using both persuasion and force to complete Norway's conversion. Both kings died in battle, Olaf Tryggvason fighting against a coalition of his enemies, Olaf II killed at Stiklestad, fighting against Norwegian nobles who resented his centralizing reforms as much as his religious policies. Yet both were remembered as Christian heroes, particularly Olaf II, whose cult became central to Norwegian Christian identity. His body was enshrined in Nidaros, modern Trondheim, which became Scandinavia's most important pilgrimage site. Sweden converted last and most gradually. The temple at Uppsala, described by Adam of Bremen as the greatest pagan sanctuary in the north, reportedly continued functioning until well into the 12th century. Swedish kings who converted faced resistance from nobles and common people alike, and Christianity spread unevenly, taking hold in some regions while others clung to the old ways. Interestingly, the Christianization of Sweden seems to have been less violent than in Norway, accomplished more through gradual cultural shift than royal imposition. By the mid-12th century, Sweden had bishops and churches throughout its territory, monasteries were being founded, and pagan practice had retreated to folklore and superstition. The conversion transformed more than just religious practice. Christianity brought Latin literacy, recorded law, new architectural forms, and integration into European diplomatic and cultural networks. The church became the largest landowner in Scandinavia, monasteries centers of learning and economic production. Bishops were often royal advisors, and increasingly, Christian ideology supported royal authority. Kings ruled by divine right, rather than merely by success in war and ability to attract followers. This ideological shift facilitated the development of more centralized monarchies, with hereditary succession replacing the earlier pattern of succession by any capable male relative. Yet much survived the conversion. Norse mythology was recorded by Christian scribes, particularly in Iceland, where the 13th century scholar, Snorri Sturluson, compiled the Prose Edda, a handbook of pagan myths for poets that preserved stories that might otherwise have been lost. Place names retained references to pagan gods. Odin, Thor, and Freya appear in countless Scandinavian place names, evidence of their former worship. Legal customs, social structures, artistic motifs, all showed continuity from pagan to Christian periods. Stave churches, the distinctive wooden churches built in Norway from the 11th century onwards, incorporated dragon head decorations and other elements from pagan tradition, creating a Christian architecture that was distinctively Norse. The conversion's impact on Viking expansion was profound. Christian kings were less willing to support raids on Christian lands, and conversion of raiding targets eliminated the religious justification that had made monasteries attractive targets. Moreover, Christianity's spread through Scandinavia roughly coincided with the end of the period of weakness that had made Western Europe vulnerable to Viking raids. By the mid-10th century, kingdoms in England, Francia, and elsewhere had developed more effective defenses, built fortifications, organized naval patrols, and learned to respond rapidly to Viking incursions. The easy plunder that had characterized the late 8th and 9th centuries was no longer available. But Vikings did not simply disappear with Christianization, they transformed, and one of their most significant transformations occurred in northern Francia, where a group of Norse settlers became the Normans, and in doing so, changed European history. In 911, Charles the Simple, king of the West Franks, granted a large territory in northwestern Francia to a Viking leader named Rollo. The arrangement was pragmatic on both sides. Charles needed protection against other Viking raiders and lacked the strength to drive Rollo out, while Rollo saw opportunity to transform from raiding to ruling, to establish a permanent domain, rather than simply extracting wealth and moving on. The territory granted to Rollo would become known as Normandy, land of the Northmen. The Normans adopted Frankish language and culture with remarkable speed. Within a generation, they were speaking French rather than Norse, Within two, they were indistinguishable in most ways from other French nobles, though they maintained distinctive characteristics: centralized ducal authority stronger than in most French principalities, military prowess and innovation, expansionist ambition. Norman dukes built castles, patronized monasteries, and participated in French feudal politics, while maintaining the martial traditions of their Viking ancestors. By the early 11th century, Normandy was one of the most powerful and well-organized principalities in France, its dukes ruling with firm authority over a prosperous territory. Norman ambition looked beyond Francia. Norman adventurers traveled to southern Italy as mercenaries in the early 11th century, fighting in the complex conflicts between Byzantine, Lombard, and Islamic powers that dominated the region. These Norman warriors gradually carved out their own territories, and by 1130, Roger II had united Norman holdings in southern Italy and Sicily into a kingdom that would last until the 13th century. The Norman Kingdom of Sicily became one of the most sophisticated states in medieval Europe, its court a center of learning where Greek, Arabic, and Latin cultures intersected, where scholars translated ancient texts and advanced mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. But the most famous Norman achievement was the conquest of England in 1066. William, Duke of Normandy, claimed the English throne based on a supposed promise from the childless King Edward the Confessor. When Edward died and Harold Godwinson was crowned king instead, William assembled a massive invasion fleet, perhaps 700 ships carrying 7,000 men, and sailed across the Channel. The invasion occurred at a fortuitous moment for William. Harold had just defeated a Norwegian invasion led by Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire, and had to march his exhausted army south to meet the Norman threat. The two armies met at Hastings on October 14, 1066, in a battle that would determine England's future. The battle was hard fought, lasting all day, with Harold's Anglo-Saxon shield wall initially holding firm against Norman cavalry charges. But gradually, Norman tactics, and perhaps the exhaustion of Harold's forces from their recent northern campaign, wore down the English resistance. Harold was killed, tradition says, by an arrow in the eye, though contemporary sources are unclear, and his army broke. William marched on London, accepted the submission of English nobles who had opposed him, and was crowned king on Christmas Day 1066. The Norman conquest of England was complete, accomplished by descendants of Vikings, who had sailed the same route that earlier Norse raiders had followed, but this time coming not to plunder but to rule. The conquest transformed England profoundly. William confiscated the lands of Anglo-Saxon nobles, who had opposed him, and distributed them to Norman followers, replacing the entire English aristocracy with Norman lords, who owed their positions to the king. French became the language of the court and administration, creating the linguistic division between French-derived words for prepared food and governance, and Anglo-Saxon-derived words for farm animals and common people that still characterizes English. Norman architectural styles produced the great stone castles and cathedrals that still dominate the English landscape. The Domesday Book, William's comprehensive survey of England's lands and resources, compiled in 1086, represents an administrative achievement unmatched elsewhere in medieval Europe, a detailed inventory of an entire kingdom. Yet England was not simply conquered and Normanized. The Normans were too few to completely replace English culture, and they needed English cooperation to govern effectively. English institutions, shire administration, legal customs, the English church survived and blended with Norman innovations. Within a few generations, the Norman aristocracy was intermarrying with English nobles who had survived the conquest or risen to prominence afterwards, creating an Anglo-Norman culture that was neither purely French nor purely English. The Norman conquest, like the Danish settlement of eastern England 2 centuries earlier, demonstrates the Vikings' remarkable capacity for adaptation, for taking what they needed from cultures they encountered and creating something new. By the late 11th century, the Viking Age was ending, though its precise end date is more arbitrary than real. Some historians mark 1066 as the conclusion. The deaths of both Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge and Harold Godwinson at Hastings, representing the passing of the last generation for whom Viking warfare was central to their identities. Others extend the period slightly later, until the reign of Magnus Barefoot of Norway in the early 12th century, the last king to conduct large-scale raiding expeditions to Scotland and Ireland in the old Viking style. But whenever we choose to mark the end, it is clear that by 1100, the conditions that had produced the Viking Age had fundamentally changed. Scandinavia itself had transformed. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were now Christian kingdoms with centralized monarchies, written laws, and participation in European diplomatic networks. Kings no longer depended on raiding to support their followers and maintain power. They had tax systems, landed estates, and royal authority backed by church ideology. The nobility had become Christianized and increasingly oriented toward continental European culture rather than maintaining purely Scandinavian traditions. Monasteries and churches had replaced pagan temples, literacy had spread among elites, and Scandinavia was firmly part of Christian Europe rather than its pagan periphery. The targets of Viking raids had also changed. England, after 1066, was ruled by Norman kings descended from Vikings themselves, and was sufficiently well organized and defended that large-scale raiding was no longer feasible. Francia had similarly developed stronger central authority and defensive capabilities. Ireland remained fragmented, but Norse settlements like Dublin had been integrated into Irish political structures, their rulers as much Irish as Scandinavian. The easy plunder that had characterized the early Viking Age was gone, replaced by kingdoms and cities that could defend themselves effectively or negotiate from positions of strength. The economic basis of Viking expansion had also shifted. The flow of silver from the Islamic world, which had powered much of Viking Age prosperity, declined in the late 10th and 11th centuries as political instability disrupted trade routes and mine production decreased. European silver mining increased, but this silver entered circulation through different channels, supporting increasingly monetized local economies rather than long-distance trade in luxury goods. The market for slaves contracted as Christian Europe became less willing to participate openly in this traffic. Trade continued, but it became more regularized, more controlled by royal authority and merchant guilds, less the domain of warrior traders who might raid one year and trade peacefully the next. What remained of the Viking Age, and what remains still, are its profound legacies. The demographic impact: Norse settlement in the Danelaw, in Normandy, in Ireland's coastal cities, in the Scottish Islands, permanently altered the genetic and cultural composition of northwestern Europe. Linguistic impact appears in the hundreds of Norse words borrowed into English, in place names across Britain and beyond, in the survival of Norse-derived languages in Iceland and the Faroe Islands. Political structures show Viking influence, from the parliamentary tradition that traces back to Icelandic Althing and Scandinavian things, to the feudal systems of Norman England and Sicily that reflected both Norse military organization and Frankish governance. The archaeological legacy is visible across the landscapes. Vikings touched, runestones stand in Swedish fields, carved memorials to men who sailed to England or the East and never returned home. Ship burials beneath Norwegian soil have preserved the vessels that made Viking expansion possible, offering modern scholars unprecedented insight into Norse technology and culture. Hoards of silver coins and hack silver, buried by individuals who never returned to retrieve them, speak to the wealth that flowed through Viking hands and the dangers of the age. Urban archaeology in Dublin, York, Novgorod, and countless smaller sites reveals the trading networks, craft production, and daily life of Viking Age towns. Museums across Scandinavia and beyond display Viking Age artifacts, weapons, jewelry, tools, everyday items that connect us tangibly to this distant time. The Oseberg ship burials' ornately carved wagon and sleds, the Jellingstone's declaration of Christian conversion, the Lewis chessman, carved from walrus ivory in the Hebrides, the Sutton Hoo helmet from Anglo-Saxon England, showing artistic exchange with Scandinavia. Each object tells stories, preserves craftsmanship, demonstrates the sophistication of Viking Age material culture. Together they paint a picture of a society more complex than the simple raiders and pirates. Stereotype: a culture that produced remarkable art, advanced technology, sophisticated literature, and legal systems that still influence modern governance. The literary legacy is equally profound. The sagas, composed in Iceland in the 13th century, but preserving earlier oral traditions, offer unmatched windows into Viking Age society, values, and historical events. The Poetic Edda preserves Norse mythology in verse form. The Prose Edda of Snorri Sturluson provides a systematic account of Norse gods and their stories. Chronicles and annals from across Europe record Viking raids and settlements from perspectives of those who suffered them. Together, these sources allow reconstruction of Viking Age history and culture with detail impossible for most medieval periods, particularly for non-literate societies. Perhaps most significantly, the Vikings entered world mythology and popular culture in ways that few medieval peoples have. The image of the Viking, the horned helmet, historically inaccurate but persistently popular. The dragon ship, the battle-axe-wielding warrior, has become iconic, used to represent strength, exploration, independence, and martial prowess. This image is both reflection and distortion of historical reality, capturing real elements of Viking culture while simplifying and romanticizing a complex society. Modern fascination with Vikings, in literature, film, television, games, and countless other media, speaks to something in the human psyche that responds to stories of exploration, courage against odds, and the shaping of new societies in distant lands. As we stand at the furthest remove from the Viking Age, more than 900 years since its end, the period still captivates, because it represents a moment of profound change, when aggressive, innovative people from the edge of Europe suddenly burst into the center of medieval history and left permanent marks on the world. They were raiders and traders, explorers and settlers, pagans who became Christians, warriors who became kings. They sailed farther and settled in more diverse environments than perhaps any people before them, from the ice fields of Greenland to the deserts encountered by Russ's traders in Central Asia, from the mist-shrouded coasts of Newfoundland to the glittering halls of Constantinople. They adapted to each environment while maintaining core elements of their identity, creating hybrid cultures that blended Norse and local traditions. The Viking Age ended not with conquest or catastrophe, but with transformation. The Scandinavians, who emerged from the Viking Age, were Christians, subjects of kings, participants in European civilization, rather than its antagonists. They had traded the longship for the castle, the raid for the tax, the warrior's glory for the knight's honor, but they had not disappeared. They had changed, as all cultures change, absorbing new influences, while contributing their own heritage to the broader tapestry of European history. The Vikings became Normans, Anglo-Danes, Russes, Irish Norse, Icelanders, distinct peoples sharing common origins, their descendants still present in populations across the North Atlantic world and beyond. When we visit the sites where Vikings lived and left their marks, we walk ground that connects directly to that distant time. At Thingvellir, the Rift Valley, where Iceland's parliament gathered, we stand where free farmers assembled to make laws and settle disputes. At York, beneath modern streets, archaeologists have uncovered the Viking city of Jorvik, with its workshops and trade goods from across the known world. At Dublin, the medieval city traces back to the Norse Longfort that became one of Ireland's major urban centres. At Hedeby, in Denmark, reconstructed buildings show how Viking Age merchants lived and worked. At Landsorg Meadows, the northernmost European settlement in medieval North America, still whispers of voyages beyond the known world. These places and countless others preserve memory and invite reflection. What drove the Vikings to leave their homelands and sail to distant shores? Partly necessity. Scandinavia's marginal agriculture could not support growing populations. Partly opportunity. The ships that made distant travel possible, and the wealth that made it profitable. Partly culture. Values that celebrated boldness, exploration, and martial achievement. Partly accident, the particular combination of circumstances in the late 8th century that made European targets vulnerable, while Scandinavian capabilities were reaching maturity. No single explanation suffices. Viking expansion resulted from multiple factors reinforcing each other, creating momentum that lasted for generations before circumstances changed, and the age gradually ended. What the Vikings achieved in those 3.5 centuries is remarkable by any measure. They established settlements from North America to the Caspian Sea. They created kingdoms that endure to this day. They forced Europe to adapt to new military and political realities. They preserved and transmitted culture and mythology that might otherwise have been lost. They pioneered Atlantic routes that would later be followed by other explorers. They demonstrated that with sufficient determination, advanced technology, and adaptability, a relatively small population from Europe's periphery could impact the entire known world. The Viking Age was an age of exploration and violence, of trade and conquest, of cultural exchange and conflict. It was a time when Scandinavians burst beyond their traditional boundaries and made themselves impossible to ignore, carving their names and achievements into stone and saga, into DNA and place names, into the very fabric of European civilization. As the story of the Vikings draws to its close, we are left with questions that echo across the centuries. What becomes of a warrior culture when the age of warriors ends? How do societies transform when the fundamental basis of their economy and identity changes? What survives when gods die and new faiths arise? The Vikings answered these questions through adaptation and transformation, becoming new peoples while preserving threads of continuity from their past. They remind us that history is not static, that cultures change and blend and create new forms, that endings are also beginnings. The Viking Age ended, But the Vikings did not disappear. They evolved, their descendants still present, their legacy woven into the lands they touched and the stories we tell about them. In the quiet of a museum, where Viking artifacts rest in cases. In the wind across Icelandic highlands, where Norse settlers once carved homes from unforgiving land. In the waters of the North Atlantic, where longships sailed beyond sight of shore, something of the Viking Age persists. Not as living culture, that time is gone, transformed into successor societies that would be barely recognizable to the raiders who struck Lindisfarne. But as memory, as history, as a chapter in the human story that demonstrates what determined people can achieve, what impact a culture can have far beyond its numbers or origins, what legacy can endure when a society produces great art and literature, along with violence and conquest. The Vikings sailed forth from the north and changed the world. That they could do so, that 3 centuries of Scandinavian expansion could leave such deep marks on history, remains one of the most remarkable stories of the medieval millennium. A story of exploration and adventure, of achievement and adaptation, written in ships and stones, in sagas and settlements, in the genes and languages of millions who never knew they carried Viking heritage. The age of the longships has ended, but their wake still ripples through history, carrying stories across time, as surely as they once carried warriors across seas.